we just have to adjust the sound here because I'm getting a lot of feedback. Okay. First of all, I want to apologize for not appearing there at your Congress in person. It just physically I've been unable to make it. So we're taking advantage of this technology so that I can communicate with you this morning. There are sort of two slight changes in the way in which I'm going to deal with the topic. The first is that, as you can see, sitting next to me is Etienne Pelaprat, who is a graduate student in the communication department. And Etienne and I have been discussing the issue for this talk for some time, and he's very naturally a part of it. And in fact, at one point, and with respect to one example, I'm going to ask him to present the example to you. The second thing is that in developing a talk on the general topic of mediation and human development, we found that the topic is so vast that it raises so many interesting questions that we could never encompass it in an hour. So what I'm going to do is to start with relatively basic ideas, which I think all of you are familiar with at some level, and then try to give an idea of an overall historical trajectory, which will bring me up to the question of networks and virtual communities. But I think, depending on the amount of time we have, I'll say a few words about that. But I hope very much that we'll have a little bit of time for discussion, and that this will not just be two talking heads and a PowerPoint presentation at a great distance, which should make it more interesting for all of you. But let me so the general topic, as indicated there, is trying to talk about mediation and human development. And as you just heard, I sort of came to these ideas through what was then referred to as Soviet psychology, now Russian psychology, and the ideas of Lev Vygotsky and Alexander Luria. And then subsequently, owing to my interactions with Uri and Ritva Engström and people in Helsinki, incorporated the work of Leontiev and other members of the Russian Cultural Historical School into my thinking. So next, my first slide. I thought it would be interesting, and this actually has to do with networks in a way, to start with Hegel. This begins from networks because the quotation came across the network from somebody I've never met before, and is a continuation of the ongoing discussion in our network, XMCA, where there's been a discussion about, among other things, Hegel and his relationship to the thinking of a number of people, Vygotsky, but John Dewey, Peirce, and others. And that's an ongoing discussion, which, of course, you're welcome to join. So I just liked this quote, and I liked how old it was, and I liked where it came from. Hegel saying, there is nothing in heaven or in nature or in mind or anywhere else which does not equally contain both immediacy and mediation. And for mediation, I would put there indirectness, or something that is not immediate. So that these two determinations reveal themselves to be unseparated and inseparable, and the opposition between them to be a nullity. So turning that from translated German into sort of everyday English, you have the basic idea that human experience is dual, that there's a duality to human life. Many other thinkers have made the same point, and it sounds a lot like ideas that I learned when I began to study Vygotsky. So I put at the bottom of the page Vygotsky's sort of general slogan that the central fact about our psychology is the fact of mediation. Now, when we talk about mediation, ordinarily, I put the next slide up, when we talk about mediation, we ordinarily refer to something like the figure on the left-hand side of your screen. There's a triangle. Initially, in Vygotsky's writing, he actually put an X for that triangle. And I've substituted a concept, because he was talking about mediation or a mediator. And for those of you who have read this aspect of my work, I prefer to use the term artifact as a quite general form of mediator in human activity, and following in my Americanized version of Ellsinki, think about that statement of the importance of mediation in terms of what the triangle on the left, where both routes between subject and object, the so-called direct route across the base of the triangle and the indirect route through some kind of mediating artifact, are always simultaneously in operation, always simultaneously relevant in the way in which Hegel said they are relevant. And so what Vygotsky was after was what he referred to as the cultural habit of behavior in the earliest articles published in English, a new structure that emerges from the combination of the elements that you have there. And one has to resist the temptation to try to think that you can analyze the subject independently of the medium and the mediators in the environment, and similarly for each of the three parts of that triangle. Now, the thing about triangles is that there's nice rigid figures. You can use them as the foundation of geodesic domes. But we're talking about a living process here. We're not talking about something that is an invariant, ideal structure that has no time extent. That always was a triangle in a sort of Platonic sense, always was a triangle, always will be a triangle. And human life, no life process is like that. It's a closed system. And we can't think about human life as a closed system. So in order to emphasize both the importance of thinking about mediation as a process which occurs in time, and emphasizing the importance of life as an open system, I prefer, when I'm talking about process, to refer to the triangle on the right, in which constantly it's the case that human consciousness must resolve information coming from two sources. It's really more than, and they could be subdivided, but one that is as if direct, running along the base, and one that's indirect, but the two are never equivalent to each other. And yet we have to somehow make meaning of our world. We have to experience the world as continuous. And if we lose that, then somebody's going to probably put us in a hospital because we're going to be sick. But that process is in the sort of constant resolution, is in the right-hand side there, which now creates a sort of next moment of activity. And if you like, if we went sort of, we're going in the direction of the study of consciousness, and creativity, which is a branch that we could take right from that diagram there, we would be focusing on that resolving process. But I want to focus today on the historical changes that have been occurring at the top of this triangle and their implications for the historical development of mediation. So I'm referring back there by saying basic spatial and dynamic structure is only a starting point, back to that triangle, to say that's just really not enough, that completely abstract figure. We have to now put stuff into it. We have to concretize what it is that we're talking about. First point in doing that is to point out that, so far as we can tell, that kind of cultural mediation, the existence of artifacts, and the existence and the evolution of Homo sapiens as a species occurred as a single process of hominization. That is, human beings or pre-human beings were already beginning to create artifacts, and that the human brain developed in an environment that was itself changed by the artifacts that humans had created. And in the most recent work I've been able to read on this topic, a lot of emphasis is put on the way in which early stone tools, and in particular tools that could be used more or less the way a knife could be used for scraping skin or cutting meat, increased the protein intake of human beings and played a very important role in the growth of the size of human beings and in the growth of the cerebral cortex. Excuse me, I didn't mean to go up to that far. However, presumably the biological characteristics of the subject, us more or less, human beings, hasn't changed noticeably in the last 40,000 years, and maybe a lot longer than that. But the artifacts that mediate our activity have changed a lot. And as a consequence, so has the social world. So if we go back to this triangle, it means that if you look at the left-hand side, that the biology of Homo sapiens has not undergone change, particularly in the last 40,000 years, but that the artifacts mediating human activity very certainly have undergone lots and lots of change. And as a consequence, the world in which we live, over on sort of on the object side of things, has become much more complicated. So the system of human life has become much more complicated, and is trying to look at the implications of that will be the focus of the talk. So, in beginning to try to differentiate between different types of mediators, I found myself focusing on the idea of psychological tools. And in a way, psychological tools, an examination of that concept would make a better subtitle for the talk than getting off into networks. Although the way in which networks can be considered psychological tools, I think is worth some discussion if we have time for it. So here you have a classic definition from Vygotsky that psychological tools are artificial formations, so right away you have the notion of artifact. By their nature, they are social and not organic or individual devices. They are directed toward should be mastery of mental processes, one's own or someone else's, just as technical tools are directed toward the mastery of processes of nature. So you have that sort of famous picture in Vygotsky's writings, in the development of higher psychological functions, or the history of higher psychological functions, where you have mediator and sort of tools going one direction and signs going the other. And to a large extent then, psychological tools will be associated with sign systems of some kind. So, not unsurprisingly, he gives as examples language, numeration, memory techniques, algebraic symbolism, works of art, writing, diagrams, maps, blueprints, and conventional signs. So in front of me is a sign that says there's a system for helping with hearing if you need it. All right, so our world is full of all of those things, but particularly conventional signs. So as soon as you walk out of the room that you're in and you walk into any main street in Finland or the United States, you're surrounded by signs. Street signs, advertising, names of places, and so on. So it's those kind of mediators that I want to focus on, and also to problematize a little bit both the notion of what constitutes a psychological tool and the extent to which you can totally differentiate or even want to totally differentiate between psychological tools and technical tools. Not that you don't want to sometimes, but you beware dichotomies, right? So considered, and why do I stop and worry about that a little bit? Well, first of all, considered as artifacts, all tools are both material and ideal. That is, they are intrinsic to human thought as well as human action. So even technical tools, so-called, right, have an aspect of ideality, and ideality is an aspect of human psychology. So we don't want to make too sharp a distinction here. And a second point is that a lot of times, insofar as, notice in Vygotsky's original definition, he makes a strong distinction between society and nature. Well, society and nature in human life, other people are we are a part of nature, and other people are a part of nature, and psychological tools, what are called, technical tools, insofar as they're changing the behavior of other people, are changing the environment within which we live and reflect back upon us in ways that have psychological consequences. So that I think in thinking about mediation, we want to avoid this sort of dichotomous thinking where tools are oriented out. Maybe in general it's true, but oriented outward, signs are oriented inward. But to deny the materiality of signs or the ideality of tools would be a mistake. And in some circumstances, it could lead us astray. Okay, now I'm going to start talking about let's call it the prehistory, the early history of mediation beyond language and beyond very simple signs. I'm sorry this is a fairly large text, but it's so interesting to me because I actually give a lecture which is called Literacy is the Root of All Evil. And the idea of this lecture is that literacy and money in their most primitive forms were very closely fused. And the other day, Etienne pointed out from the work of our colleague Jeff Bowker the following quotation. The word money, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is the writer, Mr. Hart, writing, comes from moneta, a name by which the Roman queen of the gods, Juno, was known. Moneta was a translation of the Greek mnemosine. And there you can see in mnemosine the word mnemonic, or remembering. The goddess of memory and the mother of the muses, each of whom presided over one of the 9 arts and sciences. Moneta, in turn, was clearly derived from the Latin verb moneo, whose first meaning is to remind, to put in mind of, to bring to one's recollection. There seems little doubt that for the Romans at least, money in the form of coinage was an instrument of collective memory that needed divine protection, like the arts. So reading this excited me because there's a prehistory to Rome, just like there's a prehistory to Greece, and that prehistory takes us back into the Middle East and beyond Babylonia and back to the earliest city-states. And beyond those city-states, if we go back 10,000 years, you have the very beginnings of the sedentary life and the beginning of farming, where people are not just doing hunting and gathering, but farming, where you can create a surplus. And in these little towns, when archaeologists go and look at them, they find objects that look like this. And if you look a little bit further, and you can see on the one just off to second from the right, I guess, or second from our left, looking at it, there is a sort of mystery. These were scattered all over in museums around the Middle East 20, 30 years ago, and they themselves began to be used, what we know now as, first of all, memory devices. So if you had a storehouse full of sheaves of wheat, a way of keeping count of, remembering how much wheat you had, was to, for every unit of wheat, take the lower left-hand figure here, you have something that's counting up units. And those units were initially used as a way of recording what it was that you'd accumulated, so that when you went to trade with somebody else, say somebody who was bringing salt, it became now a medium of human interaction at the same time that it was keeping track of how much accumulation you had managed. And these sorts of tokens, people weren't sure what they were for in the beginning, but they found that often you could find a hollow clay container, and if you shook it, then it would contain tokens of this sort, and that impressions, pictures of those tokens that were on the inside were on the outside. So you have here a kind of very primitive counting system and accounting system, but now there's an important transformation in the medium. So instead of having just an object sitting out like this loose, or very often with a hole in the center, so they were probably kept on threads or on strings, that they were kept in clay envelopes. Now I've skipped, for time's sake, I've skipped over the later history, but eventually people figured out that if you put pictures on the outside, it wasn't necessary to keep the things on the inside. And so what came out of that through over a period of many hundreds of years were what we understand as cuneiform clay tablets. And very interestingly, the earliest clay tablets were half of one of those envelopes. It took them a long time to make them flat. They're a lot easier to store. They don't break so easily when they're fat. And there you have the first system of writing. So that connection between money as memory and money as writing and money as memory is a very tight one. And in that sense, money memory is one of the earliest extra-linguistic psychological tools. Now, here's a completely different kind of way of creating a psychological tool. And that's Stonehenge in the central plain of Salisbury Plain in England. This picture is a picture of where you would stand on the 21st of June, unless you were a Finn and you were actually out at your country house where you had to be on the 21st of June. And only on the 21st of June, the light comes straight up over the stone that you see in the background there. And we know today, this gives you the next picture. I wanted to, I think, impressive point to look at how big those stones are. So the interesting thing here, I think, is that the stones are roughly 3 times the height of a single human being, maybe 4 times. And the Salisbury Plain of England never contained stones like this. They were brought from far away, approximately 2000 BC. In 2000 BC, there were no carts, there were no Toyota trucks to haul these things. Human beings moved them. They moved them, some of the largest ones that you see there, a distance of perhaps 50 miles from where the quarries were. But there were other very, very large stones that you can't see from this angle. They were also important to Stonehenge that came from Wales. They were brought across water to this spot. And one wants to ask oneself, what in the world are people doing when they do something like this? And what my claim is that, and it's not original with me, that Stonehenge is a calendar, but what's important about a calendar is that it creates an invariance. And it allows you to be able to coordinate with other people and to plan your own activities in a new and more sophisticated way. Now, here we have a schematic map of Stonehenge. There's a little bit of an animation here, which I'm not sure whether I can speed up or not. But what it lays out for you is the sophistication of Stonehenge, not only as a solar calendar, but as a lunar calendar. And all around Stonehenge are burial grounds, and it became a place for people living in that part of the world to come together on the summer solstice, and was the sort of center of their religious life. So here you have, and one could get other kinds of tools like this from other sources, but you have the beginning of something I think is leading not back to natural language, but leading toward various types of scientific practices where the discovery of invariances is absolutely essential. And you can see in Stonehenge the fusion of science and religion, because this was a religious site, that we're sure of, and what was it that gave the religious people who understood this site power? They could tell the future, because when you have an invariance, you know it's going to come around again, and you know when. Okay, now here we can talk about representing language. We know that language, Vygotsky believed, was extremely important for the construction of human thought, and he made a strong distinction between written language and oral language. And one of my eyes is on a clock, and I think that you probably know this work fairly well, but he really wanted to emphasize that written language changes the structure of thought. It's an abstraction of an abstraction. It's a mediation, but in a medium in which the dynamics of mediation are changed, and the written language, the writing on any of these screens, stays relatively still and can be moved across space into other kinds of contexts, so that we can read Plato. We may not be able to understand it, Plato's writing the way it was understood at the time, but we can make a reasonable interpretation, and it certainly can keep us debating about what he was saying and what the truth of it was to this day. So again, here he has the idea that it changes the interaction, that there's no interlocutor, that written speech is monologic speech, is a conversation with a piece of paper, and it requires the child to do voluntarily and with effort what they used to do effortlessly and unconsciously. And it opens up the world in a new way to children. And I think that that general belief in the importance of writing is certainly dominant in the ideology of the United States, and of almost writing constitutes a fundamental mediational foundation of all contemporary societies. So my point about writing as a tool, and a written speech as a tool, is that, first of all, this is another example where it's both a psychological tool, if we use it as such, and it's a technical tool, right? So it's operating in two directions at once, even though Vygotsky was emphasizing its psychological aspect. It provides a tool for analysis of language, and that analysis of language, David Olson and others argue, Jack Goody, reflects back upon us when we interact with it under new circumstances. And we have in the contemporary research on writing the argument over whether or not writing creates a general change in human mentality, human ways of thinking, or whether the changes are relatively context-specific. And there's a back and forth argument that I won't try to resolve here in extenso, but rather point out the resolution that most satisfies me, that the generality of the tools and the generality of their psychological effect depends upon the generality of their use. How many different forms of activity are mediated by that kind of tool system? And from my point of view, there is no such thing as a context-free tool. It's a contradiction in terms. So, and we can, if people want, we can come back and discuss that point. Vygotsky makes the same point, I think, when he talks about scientific and everyday concepts. But here, I just point out that Vygotsky did not believe that earlier genetically prior forms of concepts simply disappear and are replaced. Rather, he believed that old forms continue to dwell alongside newer, higher forms, and that they reappear under a variety of circumstances. Adult thinking, he wrote, is often carried out at the level of complexes and sometimes sinks to even more primitive levels, so that the ascription of a general transformation of thought to writing would simply deny this principle from Vygotsky. But he certainly has this idea of higher, lower there. I think all of you can appreciate the fact that you're not always thinking like college professors, and heaven help you and your spouses if you do. Now, where our sort of thinking about this led us next was to the issue of simulation and simulacra in general. So we were trying to think of, since Vygotsky was alive, died in 1934, he had the beginning of film, he would not have been aware of any, probably an abacus would be as much as he'd seen for a calculating device, but there's, at that time, there were limited opportunities for simulation of some sort of alternative world to become psychological tools, tools to think with, and also technical tools, tools to operate on nature. I think at that time, drama and literature provided maybe the most important simulacra or simulation environments that would allow people to use them as psychological tools. Whereas today, and that's where our talk is sort of going, is we want to look at digital computers as tools which enable the creation of psychological tools in the form of simulations. First of all, before, just to take the top part of that, what Vygotsky was, I don't want to trash novels here. I happen to think novels are very interesting tools to think with. So I slipped in here before we sort of jumped straight into computers to remind ourselves that Vygotsky's own work drew extensively on literary examples, in addition to the fact that he wrote on the psychology of art. So he was clearly interested in literature and in art as a medium for experiencing the world, as a psychological tool. What we want to do is to just very briefly consider the extent to which literature provides a microcosm for people to learn about themselves, and then contrast that with the potential opened up by digital media. So there's an article in Kenneth Burke's book on symbolic forms, and it's interesting that Burke, who was a literary critic and is one of the people who was a leader in the forming of symbolic interactionism, was writing this about the time that Vygotsky was living. Burke lived to be a very old man. But let me see if I, right. And what he has an article called Literature as Equipment for Living, in which what he does is an analysis that starts out with a particular genre, the genre of proverbs. And he talks about proverbs initially as equipment for living, by which he means mediational tools. He's talking in his I don't think he ever read Vygotsky. He's speaking in an American idiom about mediation in a way that's strikingly similar to the way that Vygotsky was talking. But in this article, he starts off by talking about proverbs as, and some of their functions, means for consolation, for foretelling, for admonition, for exhortation, and for naming recurrent situations. So I wrote down a couple of these. Consolation, I like this one, sometimes apply it to myself. He is not poor who has little, but he that desireth much. Or in English, the idea that a rolling stone gathers no moss. Or the proverb, the more laws, the more offenders. So all of you can think up, and you have in Finnish a rich tradition of proverbs. And Burke wants us to think about these proverbs as being tools for mediating and interpreting and encountering the world in a mindful fashion. He's arguing explicitly, that's a quotation, he's arguing against realism for its own sake, which I take to be sort of a play on the debate about art for art's sake. He wants to have some form of instrumentality in it. He wants, and what he does is to make what I call a double move. One is, starting with proverbs, he wants to analyze and emphasize their active nature, that they're used for dealing with situations that you're in. We often will use them in instructing our children. Then he wants to extend the analysis of proverbs to literature in general. Then what he does is he says, well, what proverbs and what literature does is to provide us with tools for, and a strategy for dealing with the world. And again, he does what we did with money. He goes back and he looks at the origins of the word in historical dictionary and finds that the word strategy in the English language actually it comes from Greek, right? And that word in Greek means the leading of an army. But then he goes and says, well, finds another definition, the movement of an army in a campaign so as to impose upon the enemy the place and time and conditions preferred by oneself. So here now you have to think of yourselves as encountering the world and constantly wanting to encounter the world on your own terms. You don't want to be totally dependent on others, controlled by others. And so he's now placing literature in this role as a mediator and explicitly says that literature organizes one's thoughts so as to meet the world on one's own terms. And by talking about organizing one's own thoughts, he's evoking, without knowing it, Vygotsky's idea of a psychological tool. But now, to what extent can we talk about literature as simulation? Burke makes a very strong claim that it is. The reading of a book, this is just one of his examples, the reading of a book on the attaining of success is in itself the symbolic attaining of that success. It is while they read that these readers are succeeding. He gives an example from Madame Bovary as being equivalent to the strategic naming of a situation, the situation of a bourgeois woman caught in a particular set of relationships. And that set of relationships actually became a word in the French language to name that situation. Just as the word boycott in English initially was the name of a person who was, we would now say, who was shunned by his neighbors, who would refuse to interact with him. And that typical situation had to be named. It was named for the person, and the term boycott came into the English language as a tool of analysis. And then I give a different example where Uri Engström gives the example, I'm speaking to people in Finland, of the story of the seven brothers as a strategic way of naming and identifying a zone of proximal development. So I'd like you to grant with me and with Burke the idea that in literature or in television shows or in movies, one is allowed to play with reality and one's relationship to it. To those familiar with Wartofsky's idea of tertiary artifacts, these proposals should seem quite familiar. So, and they also enter into social life, I'll add, because a lot of the time when we talk with people, we talk with them about a film that we've just seen. If we've seen an Ingmar Bergman film about a marriage relationship, it's definitely a simulacrum within which one imagines oneself and in general hopes that one isn't caught in the situations that he creates for us. Now we're going to move to the sort of modern times. First of all, clearly computers can be used as either psychological or technical tools. We're going to focus on two different ways in which computer simulations function as psychological tools. The first is taken from the domain of education, where the purpose of the creators was to create a psychological tool. The second is taken from entertainment, where its value as a psychological tool is, perhaps necessarily, maybe partly realized by the programmers, but nevertheless, its nature as psychological tool, in the way we've been talking about it, is a byproduct of the creation of a fantasy world. So I'm going to turn things over now to Etienne and to describe to you one example of a contemporary psychological tool, which you can go and take a look at on the web if you like.
So hello everyone. I'll be talking about the NetLogo software, which I didn't put on the slide, but is being piloted by Ellsinki at Northwestern in Chicago. And it's the fourth generation software from Logo, which was designed by Seymour Papert in the 70s. And the idea of that software was to explicitly design an educational tool where children could learn programming to create worlds in which they could construct meaning, was what he kind of called it. NetLogo, if you're familiar with Logo, is an environment in which you can program and run simulations of many different types of agents. So the screenshot I have here on the screen is a NetLogo screenshot of the predator-prey model. And if you're familiar with that model, it's the idea is to model population changes as predators and prey, in this case wolves and sheep, exist in a closed in a 2D environment. So NetLogo is an environment for modeling simple agents, sheep, wolves, with simple rules, rules for how to move, what to do when they're over a patch of grass, how to kill sheep, And the idea is that from the modeling of simple rules and agents, you can get emergent behavior of the system. So the software as an educational tool is designed to explore dynamic systems that exist in levels that you can look at the sheep or wolf level, and also at the total system level. And part of the motivation for this software was that the researchers were noticing a disjunct between how complex systems were taught in the classroom versus how they were practiced and explored in the real world inside scientific laboratories. So the goals of this tool are to foster that kind of thinking, foster thinking in levels such that you can apply that thinking to real world problems as it's and in practice as well.
Okay, so here we've this. It would have taken us too much memory to try to send you this model so that you could run it in real time. But what you can see on the screen, just going back to here, is that the stuff with the green patches has wolves and sheep running around on it. You can program and change the parameters of your model to see when will you reach equilibrium and when won't you, and have an alternative representation of the outcome that you're seeing that any child could interpret as the wolves are eating the sheep are eating the grass, and you can either run to extinction or you can try to create a situation of equilibrium. And what we've done here is simply to try to relate that idea of a much more complex thinking tool and putting it back within a Vygotskian framework. And this third slide shows you a little bit more. In fact, Etienne, say a little bit about the different, what the code means versus what you're seeing on the right-hand side.
So there's a direct link between the code that you can program to model a dynamic system and the simulation itself. And I don't know if you can see it, but the syntax, the programming code on the left has been highlighted. And the only point I want to make there is that the syntax and structure of the language mediates how you think about the problem. In other words, the design of the language is such that you're forced to think about the dynamic system in terms of, and program them in terms of, simple agents with rules interacting in a 2D world. And once you've programmed and have thought about the problem in that way, you can actually run the simulation. And the graphical environment, I just want to make the point that the visual representation, the dynamics of the moving agents on a 2D environment structures the natural cognitive processes such that you can visualize and see this emergent behavior. So I want to say that the code on the left as a writing system that structures how you think about the problem, how you think about modeling the environment, and the actual representation on the right in mediating the natural cognitive processes such that thinking in levels becomes apparent or becomes structured such that thinking levels can happen. The two are linked. And you can move between the two representations in the software. So those are the 3 points I wanted to make with respect to that.
Okay, so this is clearly interactive in a way that no textbook is interactive. And there's a fair, many people believe who study cognitive development in children that the ability to re-represent some idea, to represent it in a new medium, is a key moment of cognitive development. Somebody like Karmeloff Smith, for example, talks about re-representation as fundamental to cognitive development. And here you have here you have both the syntax and the artificial language which the kids are learning, and which they may not understand well at all, but it's going to help them as a tool for thinking about some other problem that they can represent to themselves quite easily. So this is available at Northwestern University on the web. And here's just sort of the entire system, kids using the language to think in levels, to think about the world, which you would like to get to be a relatively general proclivity of kids, an ability that they can use in other circumstances. Okay, now, the second example I'm drawing is adventure games. And I'm assuming, given the age of the audience, that you've at least heard about adventure games if you're not a role-playing adventure game player yourself. If you are one, then everything I'm going to say is completely obvious. And if you're not one, it might induce you to spend a little bit of time with a relatively complex role-playing adventure game. I put at the top Dungeons and Dragons as deep play, encountering betrayal, because this is a story about my son, who at the age of 10, with 4 other boys, would come home from school and play the make-believe role-playing adventure game of Dungeons and Dragons, where you gave yourself various kinds of characteristics and where the characteristics that you took on interacted with the characteristics of your colleagues as you went into a dangerous, in play, fantasy, a dangerous environment where you could get killed or robbed or bad things could happen to you. And one afternoon, he was playing this game, and he had a comrade he was playing it with. And this other little boy betrayed him. He never spoke to this child again. Never again. So the issue of what it is you're learning, and why didn't he? Because he said, anybody who would behave that way in those circumstances, I would never trust again in other circumstances. Now, that's a real life example in my life. But James G. has written a book on video games quite recently, in which, and he's a person who's done a lot of writing on the social mind, on language as social behavior, on situated learning. He's been very concerned with critical literacy and so on. So you might think, what's he doing playing adventure games? But he became convinced, initially from watching his son, but then beginning to enter into the practice himself, that these adventure games allow you to learn, to experience the real world, not just the world of the adventure game, in new ways. It allows you to affiliate with new social groups, groups of people who do this sort of thing. It gains resources for future learning and problem solving in the domain and related domains, including the content of the domain and its particular design principles. And finally, and I think to me most intriguingly, he says, you learn about yourself. That in such adventure games, you're playing with your own identity. So that you have an active learning that's very closely related to your identity as a person. And by making this sort of move around adventure computer games, he is placing what he's saying directly into that movement within sociocultural studies of looking at participation in communities of practice in which identity and learning are seen as two aspects of the same process, and where compared to standard cognitive science, participation, standard cognitive science has very little to say about identity at all, but where it conceives of identity as transformations in individual processes, G is arguing and bringing into this discussion the power of these kinds of simulations for the development of the self. He gives you a lot of examples of these kinds of games, and I don't know which sort you've played, but they're all Dungeons and Dragons type of games. And he says, for example, in one, it's sort of part Tolkien. So he's a female half-elf, whatever that means in this game, and has to go through building up the potential, the characteristics of this identity that he's taken on. He says that good role-playing in video games makes me think new thoughts about what I value and what I do. The play of identities in such games exceeds that in movies or novels, in that the choices one makes have consequences for what subsequently occurs. I take this to be a very interesting point, and I don't know how far one wants to push it, because within the simulation world within a computer, what decisions you make actually have an impact on what your future story is going to be like, whereas you don't have the opportunity to save Anna Karenina. She's going to go under that train no matter what it is that you do. And there's a famous example from Charles Dickens and the Old Curiosity Shop, where he had a heroine and everybody could see he was going to kill off this little girl. And he had a huge amount of mail because he was writing it in installments, where his public tried to get him to not go where he was going. But he nonetheless eventually got there. So the ability to change one's environment in these computer simulation games does seem to distinguish it from literature of the usual sort. And G goes further and relates the idea of adventure game playing to Erik Erikson's idea of a moratorium. He defines it slightly differently. In fact, he defines it in a way that's very much like Vygotsky defines play, or Wartowski looks at tertiary objects in art. But the idea is that you can try out different ways of being without any really serious consequences. And of course, for Erikson, adolescents in moratorium are adolescents who are driving their parents crazy by trying out all these different kinds of identities to try to figure out what kind of adult do I want to become. And if that lasts too long, then it's pathological. Just as I might suggest, if you spend too much time playing adventure games, it might be considered pathological as well, unless you're like G, and you can get somebody to pay you money for doing it because you write a book about it. Okay, so here I relate the idea then of adventure games to Wartowski's idea of a tertiary object, that is, a category of objects which come to constitute a relatively autonomous world in which the rules, conventions, and outcomes no longer appear directly practical, or which indeed seem to constitute an area of non-practical or free play or game activity. And I, in my work, have emphasized the way in which, in fact, things that you learn in participating in activity mediated by tertiary artifacts can act as psychological tools. And then finally, given that this talk is being given, so to speak, in Helsinki, I thought, and that's Ellsinki and the University of California have a close working relationship with each other, that I would simply mention a new category of psychological tools which are a part of the practice of the Developmental Work Research Unit in Helsinki, and in a different way are a fundamental part of the practice of my Laboratory of Comparative Human Cognition. So I'd like to suggest that the Change Lab routines, scenarios, instantiate the method of dual stimulation of Vygotsky in a way that help people to rethink their working lives. And in that sense, clearly operate as psychological tools for their participants. And that in our work, where we create, off of Dungeons and Dragons metaphor, so-called fifth dimension projects, where university students play and work with children in after-school environments, also is a new form of psychological tool where the creation of activity systems as psychological tools is already a reality, and a reality that I think we'll see a lot more of. So I'll just end with a few final thoughts that the increasing complexity of the mediational means that is a part of human history, including psychological tools, occurs along with the increasingly complex environment of people's everyday lives. It's very difficult to believe, however, that in any sense human beings are getting ahead of the game of life. We seem, my Swiss friend Alfred Lang likes to say, our technology rides on our backs. And so I don't know how proud we need to be about the fact that we're using these new technologies. We better use new technologies. We've got new problems created by our proclivity to use technologies. So I say maybe it's not are we not getting ahead, but that our ability to create more powerful tools may be the greatest threat facing the future well-being of our children and of our children's children. And a final point, that humility and caution, not pride and self-righteousness, should be the result of more deeply understanding the role of mediation in human life. Thank you for your attention. So, Jaco, perhaps people have a question or a remark, something they'd like to talk about in the few minutes we have remaining.
Yes. I may ask you, and there's no other questions.
I'm not, at the moment, I'm not hearing anything, so I'm going to have to take that for a no unless somebody switches the microphone.
Are you hearing now?
I hear you now.
Okay. I just, the last psychological tools you were speaking about, the triangle and this seems to me to be sort of more collective psychological tools. Have you been, compared to Vygotsky,
I think that's
thinking about
I think that's absolutely right. Well, we would have to do, if we were to pursue that line of thinking about activity systems as psychological tools, they're definitely collective in a way that Vygotsky did not theorize. He said it in principle, right, that one cannot tear apart the just like Hegel, you can't tear apart the mediational means and the social activities that they're mediating. But he himself did not pursue that line except he pointed there. He talked about the social situation of development, but he did not himself heavily engage in the design of new forms of activity. Luria did it also at the individual level in remediating people with brain damage, but again, that's not collective in the sense we're talking about here.
more comments? So maybe we thank you very warmly.
Well, thank you very much, and people, I will put this PowerPoint on our webpage, and also this entire thing is streamed live. So, and we're archiving it. So if people had difficulty because we spoke English too quickly or would like to come back to think about the ideas again, we'll make them available within the next 24. They're available right now on the web. And anybody who's a part of XMCA, I posted the URL for that, but I need to post the PowerPoint talk. And now, thank you very much for a pleasant evening in Helsinki. Copenhagen is calling, so we're going to leave you now and go to Copenhagen.
Goodbye.
Good evening. Switch it over, Scott.
So what's this one in Denmark?
They want to talk about the fifth dimension. So you don't need to. Right. What I need to do is go over here.